Welcome to God and Country Biblical Exposition. You'll have to forgive my voice this week. I picked up a cold and it went right to my throat. It's probably more painful for you to hear than it is for me to speak. Well, the subject today is regarding the legalization of marijuana. On Monday, I went down to the Trenton State House to voice opposition to a bill legalizing the sale and use of marijuana in the state of New Jersey. Both the Senate Budget Committee and the Assembly Appropriation Committee had a joint committee meeting to allow for public comment and to vote on the measure. Once it's voted out of committee, it can go to the full legislature for a final vote and then to the governor's desk for a signature. I don't think anyone missed the humor of having a joint committee meeting to discuss the marijuana bill. With so many social issues going on in the news, this marijuana issue has not been on my radar. The last time I addressed this subject was back in January of 2011, program number 37. At that time, California had just defeated Proposition 19, which would have legalized pot in California. 54% of the population were opposed, 46% were in favor. And at that time, I mentioned that it was alarming that 46% of the California population was in favor of legalizing marijuana. Well, of course, since that time, it has been legalized. In 2016, it passed. And in the November midterms, Michigan voted to legalize recreational marijuana. Utah and Missouri voted in favor of medical marijuana, which is simply the first step to the legalizing of recreational marijuana. So today, 31 states allow for medical marijuana. 9 states have legalized recreational marijuana, even though it is against federal law. Now, it's important to note that all of these states claim that they have a moral right to ignore federal law. But no state has been willing to ignore federal law in regard to abortion or same-sex marriage. It just shows us that the bias in our country favors moral depravity. So our country is just going to pot. Many polls show that 2/3 of Americans favor the legalization of recreational marijuana. Now, this is not because people personally agree with pot smoking, but people have been socially indoctrinated in the libertarian view of government. That good government means letting people do their own thing. That I may be against something personally, but I shouldn't use the power of government to regulate other people's morals. The old saying is applied, you can't legislate morality. And once that view takes hold, the whole biblical purpose for government is undermined and collapses. Legislators no longer do what God has called government to do, and the nation is firmly on the way to Sodom. The state no longer is an avenger bringing wrath on the one who practices evil, Romans chapter 13, verse 4, but the state becomes a defender of the one who practices evil. So the legalization of marijuana is truly a sign of the time. Back in October, the New Jersey state legislators passed a symbolic bill remembering and celebrating the legalization of abortion in America. And they called for the rejecting of any Supreme Court nominee who would limit abortion access, namely Brett Kavanaugh. So on my way to Trenton, the thought going through my mind was this. These legislators believe it is good and lawful to slaughter babies. So of course they are going to legalize marijuana. And not only that, expect over the next 10 years, the legalization of prostitution, the legalization of forms of pedophilia, the legalization of nudity, the legalization of cocaine. This is the spirit of the age. Since the whole ideological foundation of morals for government has been overturned, eroded, erased, whatever you want to call it, everything will be legalized, except Christianity and Christian morals. because that limits people's freedom and that convicts their conscience. Also, what we're seeing happening is the practical application of the religion of secular humanism. This is what happens when people in principle switch from Jehovah worship to Baal worship. It just takes a little while for the old laws based upon Christian beliefs to be replaced with the laws based upon paganism. People hold to the traditional morals of the past, but without a belief system undergirding it, they eventually throw off those traditions. As I have said many times in this program, unbelievers are simply waking up and saying, why have we been following all of these laws based upon God in the Bible? Let's legalize homosexuality and same-sex marriage and gambling and drugs and prostitution and pornography. Let's return to Rome. Let's return to Egypt. When I was at the State House, the committee room was packed with visitors waiting to testify on the bill. It looked as if the majority was showing up to testify in favor of the bill. And in looking around the room, it was obvious that these people were biblically illiterate, spiritually lost people. Unprincipled men, as Peter spoke about in 2 Peter. This was the Exodus 14 crowd. Let us return to Egypt. And God and his laws were never mentioned in any of the testimony. We are a people living autonomous from God. And we have come to accept as normal the absence of biblical theology from the public square. But we should never take that for granted because it is outrageous and it is offensive. What fascinated me the most in this hearing were the arguments these people put forth for legalizing marijuana. In general, all the arguments were based upon pragmatism, the man-to-man relationship rather than the man-to-God relationship. And it's the as long as I don't hurt anyone else concept of law. The proponents argued that there would be no social harm, only benefit in the legalization of marijuana. It would result in the ending of the criminal black market, the ending of the cost of arresting people over marijuana possession. Some even claimed it would reduce the demand for harder drugs. The opposition also argued pragmatically that there would be social harm. More traffic accidents, more addictions, more young people damaged by the effects of pot. What was missing was this moral argument, the rightness or wrongness of getting high off of drugs. And that moral argument is really the historic foundation for all anti-drug laws. And that was the moral foundation for our war on drugs. Now, yes, there were always the pragmatic considerations. The heavy social costs, if everyone is walking around high. But those pragmatic arguments were only convincing if the public had already on the back of their minds this belief that getting high is intrinsically evil and that society must prevent such evil. Just like we used to believe that suicide and euthanasia and prostitution, although private, were intrinsically wrong and must be deemed illegal. What we have lost is this Christian moral belief in sobriety. And that is why marijuana is being legalized. It's not simply because we think we can deal now with the social costs or that the social cost of criminalization is greater than the social cost of legalization. At the root is a change of belief concerning man's responsibility to be sober before God. And that's what I want you to take away from today's program. Getting high is no longer considered evil, just like pornography is no longer evil, and nudity is no longer evil, and LGBT is no longer evil. It is a disbelief and a rejection of God's definition of sin. Now, in all of this debate in Trenton, this underlying moral issue wasn't even discussed. But that doesn't mean it wasn't at the root, because people rarely see or admit the reason for their choices. And this moral argument could not even be made in the current legal climate, because that is a transcendent moral religious argument. And our society has determined long time ago that religious morality should have no place in government or in the public square. Since there must be a separation of church and state, transcendent morality can never be the basis of any law. The only basis that is allowed is man-to-man pragmatic considerations. And as I said, when you remove the underlying morality and you're left only with pragmatism, every vice will eventually be legalized. And this is why conservatives are losing every battle, because the foundation for morals in our country has been removed. And even conservatives no longer argue on the basis of God's transcendent moral law, because they have fallen for the lie of secularism that they must limit themselves to the secular pragmatic arguments. But they never have any teeth. Without God, all is lost. Psalm chapter 9, verse 17, the wicked will be returned to Sheol, and all nations who forget God. The discussion at the State House on Monday forgot God. And so our nation is being turned over to the grave of state-sponsored narcotics. Well, boiling down all that was said at this hearing is going to be very difficult in the short program. So here's how I'm going to break it down. First, all the fallacious arguments by the proponents. Again, what interested me the most was seeing how unprincipled people justify their lawlessness, how they suppress the truth and unrighteousness, how they muddy the water with irrelevant arguments. Second, I'd like to discuss the arguments of the opponents, or rather the arguments that should have been made by the opponents. So first, the false arguments of the proponents. I expected money to be the main argument, that legalizing cannabis would bring millions into state coffers. But given the finances of the states that have already legalized cannabis, that argument could not be made honestly by the legislators. And they knew this. They could not promise great tax revenues by legalizing cannabis. And so throughout the day, the legislators said constantly, it isn't about the money. Here are some economic facts. First, the social cost of legalizing marijuana will outstrip any increases in revenue. All of the new state oversight, all of the new enforcement is going to eat up these tax revenues, not to mention the social cost of more addictions. Second, there's no extra tax revenue because of the substitution factor. If people aren't buying cannabis, they're going to be spending their money on things they already purchase. Beer, cigarettes, lottery tickets, even grocery store items. Cannabis doesn't create any more wealth. It just takes money from one pocket and puts it in another pocket. Mostly into the pockets of the cannabis companies. Third, the black market. The evidence coming out of Colorado is that the black market has boomed. Because now that cannabis is legal, why would anybody pay $120 an ounce to buy marijuana at a state dispensary when they can get it on the streets for $40? One of the more interesting testimonies on Monday was from a man who called himself the New Jersey Weed Man. And he admitted that if New Jersey legalizes pot, he will be able to sell more of it on the streets. His only complaint was that the big, white, rich cannabis companies get to sell it, not the guys on the street. So whatever tax money will be coming in from cannabis sales will be undermined by the black market. Now, as it stands, the governor wants a 25% tax on the sale of cannabis. The the legislature only wants a 12% tax. Maybe because they know that the more they tax, the greater incentive there will be for the black market. Just to note that the tax on cigarettes in New Jersey is 30%. So it kind of seems odd that cigarettes will be taxed higher than marijuana. But the proponents of cannabis want a lower tax because they want easy access. They don't want to limit consumption. Now, besides the money argument, another argument for the legalization of marijuana is not what we would expect. Racism and social justice. Yes, the proponents actually tied racism to the criminalization of marijuana, which is not surprising because racism is the only evil that secularists can decry. One proponent even stated that the original laws making marijuana illegal back in the 1930s were pushed out of racism by an alleged racist, Harry Anslinger, head of the Federal Bureau of Narcotics back in the 1930s. One of the proponents for marijuana claimed America's illegal drug policy was rooted in white supremacy. Now, the ideology here is that when the Mexicans started bringing pot into the United States, the anti-pot legislation was simply a ploy to demonize Mexicans. And the anti-opioid legislation was simply a ploy against Chinese immigrants. This is the teaching of critical theory. Academia is teaching that everything is about the oppressors trying to find ways to control the oppressed. And it doesn't even enter into their minds that our forefathers outlawed hallucinogenic drugs because they believed it was morally evil to get high. Critical theorists today can't even comprehend the moral motive because they don't believe in moral absolutes. So for them, all moral law must be based on a subconscious desire for power. And they don't even understand that years ago, the American Christian culture was grieved over Europeans bringing over to the United States bars and nightclubs and prostitution and drugs. It wasn't about race. It was about the difference between Protestant moral values and the vices coming over from less Christian countries. Now, what's amazing is that this philosophy of critical theory has worked its way into the classroom and has now worked its way into the halls of the legislature. Now, the racism argument that was put forth in this hearing continued with the contention that since blacks or minorities are arrested for drugs more often, then in order for there to be racial parity, pot should be made legal. Because look at how the minorities are going to jail or having their records ruined for being caught with pot. Now, most of us think, well, how about not doing that which is illegal, like smoking pot? Well, if you say that, you're thinking like old people. Because the new way of thinking is that the law must be wrong. These people can't help themselves. This is part of their culture. Pot is part of being black. And what was surprising is that there were a number of black ministers testifying in favor of legalizing marijuana in order to stop the arrest of black men in their community. Their claim that it was that these arrests were ruining the community. But on the other hand, there was a black minister and one of the black legislators in New Jersey, Ronald Rice from the Newark area, who opposed the legislation, saying legalized marijuana will actually ruin the black community. That the arrests were not the problem. The drug was the problem. But it was interesting to see how unprincipled people blame the law for their problems, not their behavior. In fact, in a sane world, if your people or your community has more arrests for illegal drug use, that would be a good thing. Thank you for holding us to a higher standard. That's the way I would want my family to be treated. In the words of St. Augustine, 4th century preacher, clearly it is a happier lot to be a slave of men than of lust. In other words, so what if the government oppresses you, if it is keeping you from your illicit desires? Again, what was really behind the proponents' argument is that they don't believe getting high is a moral evil. They don't see it as such a big deal. And they have no conviction over the wrongness of selling drugs or getting stoned. And that's why they believe their community is being persecuted by drug laws. As one senator even said, selling illegal drugs is just a way for some families to make ends meet. So those are two arguments from the proponents, the money argument and the racism argument. All the other arguments put forth by the proponents were simply appeals to lawlessness, to the libertarian view of government. We're already doing it, so why not legalize it? We have been ineffective on the war on drugs. People who have been arrested for marijuana have scarlet letters upon them. We can't arrest our way out of illegal drugs. We have to legalize it to control and regulate it. Why lock up nonviolent criminals? Now, all of these complaints could easily be solved by decriminalizing marijuana rather than legalizing it. In other words, lessen the penalty for marijuana possession, make it a fine, and have some sort of expunging of people's records. But no, the proponents double down on claiming that the only solution is full legalization, which shows that these arguments were simply a pretext for legalization. Other arguments. One proponent said, arresting people for marijuana separates families. Well, that's a switch. It used to be that the use of drugs destroyed families. That's why we have to stop it. One proponent said, this is the 21st century. It's time we legalize marijuana. And we hear this all the time. This is a justification for legalizing every vice. It's this argument that assumes that throwing off the morals of the past is an advancement. It's an assumption without offering any proof. Then there was also this favorite argument. We already allow alcohol. Patrick Kennedy, the son of Ted Kennedy, a former congressman from Rhode Island who now lives in New Jersey, came down to the hearing to testify against the legalization of marijuana in New Jersey. After his testimony, Senator Scutari, the sponsor of the bill, played the alcohol argument. I'm going to play the audio. It's only about a minute long. I just want to give you a sense of the debate. I wish I could have gotten some video, but I wasn't standing in a good place. Scutari begins by questioning Kennedy.
Just based on your testimony, I would assume that you believe that this body should prohibit the sale of alcohol in the state of New Jersey. Is that correct?
No, I
You
think...
just said that we didn't learn our lesson from alcohol, so would you suggest that we prohibit the sale of alcohol in the state of New Jersey? Would that benefit our children and our citizens?
Senator, I know what you're doing right now.
I'm not doing anything. I'm asking you if that's your opinion.
Can I just answer your question?
It's really simple, yes or no. Do you believe it should be prohibited?
Seriously, I mean, I know there's a rhetorical thing. It's good for your media to play this game.
I'm not doing it for the media. I'm
Yeah,
asking
I know
you what
you're
your
doing it
opinion
for.
on prohibition of alcohol is.
That's just such a red herring. We all know
You
what we're
brought
here.
it up, sir.
So I think we ought to regulate the sale of hard liquor on cable TV news. That's my answer. There's no way putting this horse back in the barn. And frankly, it's been an accepted cultural issue to have alcohol sold in this country. And I don't think that's what I'm about trying to change. I would like to see much more stringent regulations on it.
So here's the answer to Scutari's question. Your teenager says he wants to buy a motorcycle to race motocross. And you say, no way, it's too dangerous. And he says to you, but you let me ride my bicycle across the street, across the highway, and more kids die on bicycles than on motorcycles. And so as a wise parent, you say, well, you've just made a good argument for prohibiting me from letting you ride your bicycle on the highway. The point here is this. The allowance for one dangerous behavior is never justification for two dangerous behaviors. The principle is this: never justify bad behavior with other bad behavior, because if you start doing that, you will go down the road to complete moral debauchery. And this is so basic to ethical thought, but people with an agenda miss it. So in summation, all of these arguments for legalization are all rooted in a belief that getting high is morally acceptable. If it weren't for that foundational error, none of their arguments would stand. Take, for example, the crime of murder. Imagine if someone were to argue, we have to legalize murder because people are already doing it. So why not legalize it? We have been ineffective on the war on murder. People who have been arrested for murder have a scarlet letter upon them. We can't arrest our way out of murder. We still have as many murders now as in the past. And it costs us so much to arrest and incarcerate these people. We have to legalize it to control it and regulate it. Arresting people for murder separates families. And this is the 21st century. It's time to legalize murder. If we legalize it, we can actually get rid of the black market for murder, the hitmen. And if we make murder legal, we can tax it and make billions in revenue for public school and the elderly. The same arguments could be made for the legalization of child pornography. And we would all say that is absolutely ridiculous, because at least our society still has a strong moral conviction against murder, against child pornography, against rape. Well, we used to have that strong moral conviction against personal drug use, that it was morally evil to hurt yourself with drugs, to waste your time, to waste your brain, to make yourself a less productive member of society. It would have been more honest if the legislators and the proponents would have simply argued morals have changed and we no longer think getting high is morally unacceptable. The problem here is the dumbing down of morals. And why is that? Because we have an increasingly biblically illiterate society, an increasingly ungodly society. The main argument refuting the legalization of cannabis is ultimately God's moral prohibition against drunkenness. And drunkenness, as mentioned in the Bible, is not limited to alcohol, but to any substance that causes a person to check out from reality, to be inebriated, to be intoxicated. And drunkenness never produces anything good, whether done publicly or privately. The first reference to drunkenness in the Bible is in the case of Noah. It ruined his testimony. It shamed and cursed his son. The next reference is to Lot in Genesis 19. He became drunk and it resulted in immorality. And Israel, in her last days of apostasy, became a nation of drunkards. Isaiah chapter 28, woe to the drunkards of Ephraim. Isaiah chapter 5, verse 11, woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may pursue strong drink, who stay up late in the evening that wine may inflame them. Isaiah 5:22, woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink. And in the biblical book of the Revelation, it speaks about the condition of the world in the final period of the apocalypse. Revelation chapter 9, verse 21 reads, and they did not repent of their murders, nor of their sorceries, nor of their immoralities, nor of their theft. The Greek word here for sorceries is the word pharmakia, from where we get the word pharmacy, and it isn't as much about the occult as it is about getting high. In the ancient world, sorcery and hallucinogenic drugs were synonymous. So in the last days, in abandoning God, for the lust of the flesh, the world will love the high of drugs. So it's no wonder that it is being legalized. and intensified. Most people don't understand that cannabis, as it's sold today, is not your father's joint. 20 years ago, natural marijuana had a THC level of about 3.7%. With scientific breeding of marijuana plants, marijuana today contains 3 times as much, about 10%. And some varieties have as high as 25%. And the cannabis industry is offering all sorts of THC products. You can buy extracts that are 50 to 80% THC. And these shops in Colorado have cannabis granola bars and gummy bears and brownies and cookies and fruit punch and root beer. There are cannabis sweeteners for tea and coffee. So imagine how THC is going to work itself into our culture. World Magazine did a 4-part series on cannabis explaining how the soft drink manufacturers and the beer manufacturers are working to jump into the THC market. What will this do for our children, the next generation? I want you to listen to the first part of Kennedy's testimony. It's only 3 minutes, and he makes a good case.
On this issue, I'm here as a father. I have 5 healthy children, all born here in New Jersey, all growing up here in New Jersey. Last thing I want is a bunch of edibles sold at every corner. Last thing I want are these equivalent of Red Bulls with THC in them, you know, these Fanta Great Bades that have them. Last thing I want are THC ice cream. Our kids have enough challenges. I watch the mental health issues around this country because I've had the chance to travel. Major depressive disorders going up, major anxiety disorders going up. Our kids are more detached because of their technology. And you know what? Marijuana is going to feel good to those kids with anxiety. Unfortunately, because our schools really don't teach social emotional learning, they have very few coping skills and problem-solving skills to help them deal with their emotional challenges. The quick fix is going to be one of these marijuana products, especially if you've got an industry whose profit motive is bent on how many of these products they can sell. So I heard the sponsor talk about the problem with pharmaceutical companies over-marketing OxyContin. The sponsor's absolutely right about that. You know why Purdue Pharma over-marketed? Because there was a profit motive. The sponsor mentioned the liquor industry and how that needs to be better regulated. But all of us as legislators know what it's like to regulate the liquor industry. There are several lobbyists for every one of us in the state legislatures and in Congress. That's the reason why we allow liquor to be marketed on cable TV, is because of their power in state legislative capitals in the United States Congress. My point is, if it hasn't worked for alcohol, if it hasn't worked on OxyContin, what in the world makes you think you can keep this horse in the barn and keep them from actively marketing to kids? Because understand, that's their profit motive, is getting new consumers. And those consumers, thankfully for them, are going to be those with higher incidences of anxiety, higher incidences of depression, and those that are going to be more prone to addiction. And my friends, I know right now you're in a financial budget crisis, and I suspect that the reason this hearing is in the Budget Committee as opposed to the Public Health Committee where it ought to be is because what you're really after today is a quick financial fix. But as a former addict myself, I can tell you quick fixes don't work. In the long haul, you're going to have bigger problems in the long run. And so I urge this committee to vote no on this legislation and deal with the criminal justice problems and racial bias, which there is, but deal with that issue. Do not conflate the two, because as my good friend Senator Rice said, that is a real issue that needs to be addressed. But you need to address that head on and not hide that issue behind this in order to get this marijuana industry into this state and marketing to our citizens.
Well said, Patrick Kennedy. Legalized marijuana is every parent's nightmare. You know, it's hard enough to keep our teens straight without the government undermining our morals. When the government legalizes something, the government normalizes it. It gives it an aura of respectability. Even if the public ignores the law, so that 10, 20, 30% of the public starts smoking pot. If the government at least keeps it illegal, it stays in the realm of social unacceptability. But as soon as the government legalizes something, for most people, it becomes a good thing. The government is not just legalizing marijuana, the government is the new drug pusher on the street. The government is legitimizing an industry that destroys people. And with legalization, you're not going to get less pot smoking, you're going to get more. And this legislation is actually being pushed in the middle of an opioid crisis we're having in the state of New Jersey. 8 people are dying every day in the state of New Jersey from drugs, from overdose. And so how do our legislators respond? By legalizing drugs, by making more addicts. The Wall Street Journal had an article this week. U.S. life expectancy falls further. There's a rising suicide rate and deaths from opioid drugs. We're losing too many Americans too early, too often to conditions that are preventable, says the head of the CDC. So Habakkuk chapter 2, verse 15. Woe to you who make your neighbors drink, who mix in your venom even to make them drunk. Or how about Matthew chapter 18, verse 6? Whoever causes one of these little ones to believe in me to stumble, it would be better for him to have a heavy millstone hung around his neck and be drowned in the depths of the sea. The politicians who are passing these laws will have guilt on their hands. So the bottom line here is that drunkenness is a very serious sin. 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 10, drunkards will not enter the kingdom of heaven. And Satan would want nothing more than to dull people's senses, lest they could think clearly, come to their senses, and come to the light of the glory of the gospel of Christ. I mean, every day he can keep people in a stupor is one day more he can keep them from doing business with God. And I hope you have done business with God. And I hope you found new life in Christ. Since this YouTube is going kind of long and I'm losing my voice, I'm going to have to stop here. I always like to cover a subject as completely as possible. I have all sorts of other interesting arguments and comments from legislators, but I believe the point has been made. Marijuana is being legalized because people no longer believe that getting high is a serious sin against God and man. And so when this subject arises, that is the core message that we need to share. Thank you for taking the time to watch this expose on the subject. Thank you for keeping up with the weekly videos. I hope they help you abound in real knowledge and in all discernment. May God continue to richly bless you.